The date is January 17, 1991. The location is the darkened, frantic interior of a mobile command post, buried somewhere in the vast, arid scrubland of western Iraq. The air is thick with the smell of diesel fumes and cheap tobacco. Men in olive-drab uniforms are shouting coordinates, their voices cracking with a mixture of adrenaline and existential dread. Outside, the night sky is about to be torn open by fire. For the Iraqi missile crews, this moment is the culmination of a desperate gamble. The coalition air war has begun. The sky above Baghdad is already a kaleidoscope of anti-aircraft tracer fire and the terrifying unseen strikes of stealth aircraft. Saddam Hussein's air force is being systematically dismantled on the ground. His communications network is shredded, but he has one card left to play. One weapon that he believes the American superpower cannot stop. It is a weapon of terror, a blunt instrument designed not for tactical precision, but for strategic chaos. They call it the Al-Hussein. To the rest of the world, it is known as a modified Soviet R-17 Elbrus, or more commonly, the SCUD-B. But the engineers in Baghdad have done something radical to these Soviet machines. They have cannibalized them. They have welded fuel tanks from one missile onto another, extending the fuselage, reducing the warhead weight, and dangerously shifting the center of gravity. They have turned a short-range tactical weapon into a strategic terror weapon capable of reaching Tel Aviv and Riyadh. The order comes down the line. Keys are turned. Igniters fire. With a roar that shakes the desert floor, the Al-Hussein missiles lift off. They ride pillars of dirty orange flame, climbing vertically, accelerating through the thick lower atmosphere. In the command post, the Iraqi officers watch the telemetry. The missiles are performing perfectly. They are climbing past Mach 1, Mach 2, Mach 3. The boosters burn out and the warheads separate, continuing their ballistic arc through the vacuum of space. This is the moment of triumph. According to every military manual, every physics textbook, and every Soviet advisor who had trained them for decades, the job of the launch crew is done. Once a ballistic missile enters its terminal phase, the free fall back to Earth, it is unstoppable. It is a rock dropped from the edge of space, falling at over 5,000 miles per hour. There is no defense against gravity. There is no defense against physics. The targets are the cities of Israel. The strategy is simple and brutal. Provoke Israel into retaliating. If Israel joins the war, the fragile coalition of Arab nations fighting alongside the United States will shatter. The war will become a holy conflict, Zionism versus the Arab world. Saddam Hussein does not need to defeat the American military. He just needs to break their alliance. And these missiles are the hammer that will do it. But then, the reports start coming in. They do not come from forward observers in Tel Aviv immediately. They come from the strangest of sources, live television broadcasts, and confused signals from the few remaining radar stations that haven't been obliterated by American HARM missiles. The Iraqi commanders are waiting for the reports of massive devastation. They are waiting for the images of craters in downtown Tel Aviv. They are expecting the panic that follows a successful ballistic strike. Instead, they see confusion. On the television screens, beaming globally via satellite, the night sky over Israel is not filled with the singular, catastrophic flash of a warhead impact on the ground. It is filled with streaks of light ascending upward. It looks like a meteor shower running in reverse. The Iraqi officers stare at the grainy footage. They see the white-hot streak of their Al-Hussein warhead re-entering the atmosphere, glowing from the friction of the air. It is exactly where it is supposed to be. But then, a second streak appears. A smaller, faster ribbon of fire rising from the ground to meet it. The two lights converge. There is a flash. A blossoming cloud of debris high in the air, miles above the city streets. The telemetry cuts out. In the bunker, there is a moment of stunned silence. A technical failure, a premature detonation. The Al-Hussein is a Frankenstein weapon. The welding is often poor, and the structural integrity during re-entry is questionable. Perhaps the missile broke up under the aerodynamic stress. That must be it. The warhead disintegrated before it could reach the target. They order a second launch, then a third. The same pattern repeats. The telemetry confirms a good launch. The trajectory is perfect. The missile arcs over the border, begins its descent, accelerates to hypersonic speeds, and then nothing, just static. Or worse, reports of explosions occurring in the sky, not on the ground. Confusion begins to curdle into fear. The Soviet military manual stated clearly that intercepting a ballistic missile in the terminal phase is a mathematical impossibility for a tactical system. To hit a bullet with another bullet, while both are traveling at supersonic speeds, requires computing power and radar tracking speeds that simply do not exist in a field-deployable unit. The Americans have the Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars, but that is a research program, a fantasy of lasers and space mirrors. It is not a truck parked in a suburb of Tel Aviv. So what is happening to the missiles? Before we dive deeper into this technological anomaly that baffled the Eastern Bloc, if you enjoy unraveling the hidden mechanics of history's greatest conflicts, make sure to subscribe to Cold War Impact. We investigate the technology, the strategy, and the secrets that defined the 20th century. The confusion is not limited to the Iraqi launch crews. Thousands of miles away, in Moscow, high-ranking generals of the Soviet military are watching the same CNN broadcasts. They are monitoring the situation with a growing sense of unease. For the Soviet Union, this is not just a regional conflict in the Middle East. This is the supreme test of their military philosophy. The Iraqi army is a proxy for the Soviet Red Army. They are equipped with T-72 tanks, MiG-29 aircraft, MiG-25 interceptors, and endless stockpiles of Soviet artillery. And the cornerstone of Soviet offensive doctrine is the ballistic missile. The Soviet strategy for a war in Europe relies on the assumption that NATO cannot stop a massed ballistic missile attack. If the Americans can stop a SCUD, can they stop a nuclear-tipped SS-20? Can they stop the ICBMs that form the backbone of the Soviet nuclear deterrent? The reports from Baghdad are fragmentary, but the implications are terrifying. The Iraqis are claiming that ghosts are knocking their weapons out of the sky. Some reports suggest the missiles are hitting an invisible wall. Others claim the Americans have deployed a secret energy weapon. The reality on the ground in Israel is a chaotic spectacle that defies logic. The night sky is illuminated by pyrotechnics that no one has ever seen before. To the uneducated eye, it looks like fireworks. But to the expert eye of a Soviet ballistics officer, it looks like a violation of the natural order. The Al-Hussein warhead is a heavy, dumb object falling at Mach 5. It does not maneuver. It does not emit jamming signals. It is brute force incarnate. To stop it, you would need a system that can detect a small object diving out of the stratosphere, calculate its future position within a fraction of a second, launch a countermeasure, and guide that countermeasure to a collision point with zero margin for error. The Soviets know the Americans have good radar. They know they have good surface-to-air missiles for shooting down airplanes. But airplanes are slow. Airplanes are fragile. A ballistic missile is a solid metal dart. What the Iraqi commanders are seeing on their screens is a statistical anomaly that refuses to go away. One missile failure is bad luck. Two is a coincidence. But a sustained pattern of mid-air detonations suggests that the enemy has changed the rules of the game. The stakes could not be higher for Saddam Hussein. His entire strategy for survival hinges on expanding the war. He needs to draw Israel in. He needs dead civilians in Tel Aviv to parade on television to rally the Arab street. He needs the chaos that only a successful missile strike can generate. He demands answers from his generals. Why are the missiles not detonating on target? Are the crews incompetent? Is the sabotage coming from within? The generals have no answers. They check the guidance gyroscopes. They check the fuel mixtures. They verify the coordinates. Everything is correct. The missiles are working. The weapon system is functioning exactly as designed. And yet, they are failing. The mystery deepens when Iraqi intelligence tries to intercept coalition communications. They hear frantic chatter from American pilots and ground controllers, but it is not the chatter of men who are terrified of the incoming missiles. It is the chatter of men who are coordinating a turkey shoot. SCUD launch detected. Vector 360. Tracking. Engagement sequence initiated. Birds away. Splash. Good kill. Splash. Good kill? These are terms used for shooting down slow, lumbering bombers or fighters. They are not terms used for intercepting hypersonic ballistic threats. The cognitive dissonance is overwhelming. The Iraqis are firing the unstoppable weapon, and the Americans are treating it like a clay pigeon. In the Kremlin, the analysis is darker. If the Americans have developed a shield that can effortlessly swat down Soviet-designed missiles, then the balance of power that has held the Cold War in check for 40 years has just evaporated. Mutual assured destruction relies on the certainty that the missiles will get through. If they don't, then the Soviet Union is defenseless. The Soviet analysts begin to pull files on every known American air defense system. They look at the Hawk, the Chaparral, the Stinger. None of them have the range or the speed. They look at the experimental projects. They look at the rumors of black budget programs. They are looking for a monster. A massive, sprawling complex of radar dishes and heavy interceptors that would be required to perform such a feat. But satellite reconnaissance of the area shows nothing of the sort. There are no massive concrete bunkers. There are no city-sized radar arrays. There are just trucks. Ordinary-looking trucks parked in sand berms, deploying boxy canisters. It looks like standard field equipment. It looks mundane. And that is what makes it so terrifying. If this capability is mobile, if it is compact, if it can be set up in a few hours on a dusty patch of ground in Israel or Saudi Arabia, then the Americans have achieved a technological leap that the Soviet scientists calculated would take another 20 years to master. The mystery is not just what is stopping the missiles. The mystery is how did they do it without us knowing. As the night wears on, the barrage continues. The Iraqis fire in salvos, trying to overwhelm the defense. They fire at different trajectories. They try to time the launches to coincide with American radar downtime. It doesn't matter. The result is always the same. A flash in the sky, a rain of hot metal, and a city that remains frustratingly, impossibly intact. For the Iraqi missile crews, the fear shifts. It is no longer just about failing the mission. It is the realization that they are fighting a ghost. They are throwing spears at a foe who has invented a force field. And as they prepare the next volley, sweating in the cramped bunkers, they can't shake the feeling that the Americans are not just stopping the missiles, they are watching the launch sites, triangulating the source, and preparing a response that will be far more accurate than the crude weapons the Iraqis are firing. The impossible has become routine, and the world is watching it happen live. The sun rises over the Arabian Peninsula, revealing a landscape that has fundamentally changed overnight. To the casual observer, the desert looks the same endless stretches of sand, heat shimmer, and the distant haze of oil fires. But to the intelligence officers of the Soviet Union, the map of the Middle East has become a crime scene. The investigation begins not in the field, but deep within the concrete bowels of the GRU headquarters in Moscow, just hours after the first barrage. The mood is not one of panic, but of cold, professional fury. The Soviet Union is the world's premier land power. Their military doctrine is built on the certainty of mathematics. They have calculated the throw weights, the drag coefficients, and the terminal velocities of every missile in the NATO inventory. They have run simulations of World War III thousands of times. In none of those simulations did a standard field air defense system successfully intercept a ballistic missile barrage with such apparent ease. General V.I. Varenikov and the Soviet military advisors, who had spent years training the Iraqi army, are now frantically trying to piece together what happened. They pull the technical schematics of the R-17 Elbrus. They review the modifications the Iraqis made to create the Al-Hussein. The first theory is mechanical failure. The Soviet engineers argue that the Iraqi modifications were too crude. By lengthening the fuel tanks and reducing the warhead weight to increase range, the Iraqis had destabilized the missile. Perhaps the missiles were simply breaking apart upon re-entry, snapping like dry twigs when they hit the dense wall of the lower atmosphere at hypersonic speeds. This theory is comforting. It preserves the Soviet worldview. It means the American technology isn't superior. The Iraqi workmanship is just inferior. It suggests that the interceptions seen on CNN were just the visual spectacle of structural failure. But the intelligence reports coming from their assets in the region contradict this. Spies and signals intelligence operators stationed in neutral embassies in the region begin to relay descriptions of the debris recovered from the streets of Riyadh and the outskirts of Tel Aviv. They describe seeing the twisted wreckage of the SCUD missiles, yes, but mixed in with the Soviet-made titanium and steel are fragments of something else. They find shrapnel from a different kind of warhead. They find evidence of high explosive fragmentation that detonated proximity to the SCUD, not inside it. This is the smoking gun. The missiles didn't just break, they were murdered. The investigation shifts from why did the missiles fail to what killed them. The Soviet analysts turn their attention to the American electronic order of battle. They know the Americans have deployed the MIM-104 Patriot system to the theater, but the file on the Patriot is dismissed almost immediately by the senior generals. The Patriot, the briefings state, is an anti-aircraft system. It was designed in the 1970s to shoot down slow-moving bombers and maneuverable fighter jets. It operates on a specific radar frequency, and uses a blast fragmentation warhead designed to shred aluminum aircraft wings. It was never designed to catch a falling rock moving at Mach 5. The geometry of the engagement is completely different. To hit a plane, you aim for where it will be in 10 seconds. To hit a ballistic missile, you have to hit a target that is closing at over 1 mile every single second, with a radar cross-section the size of a trash can. The Soviet mathematicians run the numbers again. For a standard Patriot system to intercept a SCUD, the radar would need to track the target, verify it, calculate a firing solution, and launch the interceptor in a window of time that is mathematically impossible for the known processing power of the Patriot's computer. The system simply shouldn't be able to think that fast. This leads to the ghost theory. Paranoia begins to set in within the Soviet military establishment. If the Patriot is just a cover, what are the Americans actually using? Reports begin to circulate about a secret laser weapon. The Strategic Defense Initiative Star Wars was widely mocked in the press, but the Soviets always took it seriously. They suspected the Americans were further ahead in directed energy weapons than they admitted. Could this be a field test? Is there an invisible laser mounting on a truck somewhere in the Saudi desert, burning holes in the SCUD fuel tanks? Other theories are even more desperate. Some analysts suggest the Americans have hacked the Iraqi guidance chips. They speculate that the CIA infiltrated the supply chain years ago and installed a kill switch in the electronics of every SCUD missile sold to the Middle East. This theory gains traction because it explains the unexplainable without admitting that American kinetic technology is superior. It's easier to believe in a grand conspiracy of sabotage than to admit that the enemy's engineering is a generation ahead. Meanwhile, back in Baghdad, the confusion is turning into a tactical nightmare. The Iraqi commanders are trying to adjust. They are not scientists, they are soldiers. They see their best weapon being swatted down, so they try to brute force the solution. They change the launch tactics. Instead of single launches, they try ripple fire 3 missiles at once. They try firing at night, then at dawn. They try low-angle launches to minimize the flight time. The Soviet observers watch closely. This is the ultimate field test. During one particular barrage, the investigation uncovers a bizarre phenomenon that confuses both the Americans and the Soviets. The Iraqi Al-Hussein missiles, due to their poor welding and shifted center of gravity, are aerodynamically unstable. As they re-enter the atmosphere, they don't fall straight. They corkscrew. They tumble. The Soviet analysts watching the radar tracks see the target signature blooming, shifting and wobbling on the screen. "Look at that," an analyst points out. "The target is maneuvering. For a brief moment there is hope. If the missile spirals, it should be impossible to hit. A computer predicting a ballistic arc will miss a spiraling target every time. And yet, the American interceptors adjust. They waver, they correct, and they strike. This is the terrified realization that begins to dawn on the Kremlin. The American system is not just following a pre-programmed math equation. It is thinking. It is reacting in real time to a chaotic, tumbling target. The Soviet investigation identifies the key component of this mystery, the radar. They know the Patriot uses the AN divided by MPQ-53 radar set. It's a phased array radar, a flat face of thousands of electronic elements that steers the beam electronically rather than mechanically spinning around. The Soviets have similar technology, like the S-300 system. But the S-300 is a massive, heavy beast. It takes time to set up. It takes a battalion to operate. The American radar is doing something that shouldn't be possible. It is searching the entire sky, tracking 50 targets simultaneously, identifying the SCUDs, discriminating them from the debris of their separated fuel tanks, and guiding multiple missiles to intercept, all automatically. The legend of the automatic war begins to build. The Soviet liaisons report back that the American crews are barely touching the controls. The computers are fighting the battle. The humans are just watching the screens. This is a profound cultural shock. In Soviet doctrine, the human commander is central. The system serves the man. The idea that a machine could be trusted to execute the entire kill chain, detect, track, fire, kill without human intervention is anathema. It implies a level of trust in software that the Soviet military does not possess. But the evidence is piling up in the streets of Tehran and Haifa. The investigation turns to the wreckage of the interceptors themselves. The Iraqis managed to recover pieces of the American missiles that missed or fell back to Earth. They ship photos and descriptions to their Soviet advisors. The findings are puzzling. The American missile is small, It looks like a standard telephone pole with fins. It doesn't look like a super weapon. It has a conventional high-explosive warhead. It is just a Patriot, the reports conclude. It is the PAC-2 variant. The PAC-2 designation was known, but it was assumed to be a minor upgrade, a software patch, a slightly better fuse. The Soviets cannot reconcile the physical reality of the weapon with the results it is achieving. It is like watching a Ford sedan win a Formula One race. The vehicle looks ordinary, but it is performing impossibilities. The wrong conclusion that ultimately settles in the minds of the Soviet leadership is one of overestimation. They begin to believe that the Americans have achieved a total transparency of the battlefield. They assume the Americans have a network of satellites providing real-time, second-by-second targeting data directly to the missile batteries. They assume there is a global Skynet-style infrastructure supporting these batteries. They fail to realize the terrifying truth. The capability is self-contained. The magic isn't in a satellite network or a laser. The magic is in the code. The Americans have done something the Soviets struggled with: miniaturization of processing power. They have crammed a supercomputer into a truck. As Part 2 draws to a close, the mystery for the enemy has shifted. It is no longer, what is it? They know it is the Patriot. The mystery is now, how can it be this accurate? And how do we defeat it? The Soviet generals look at their own nuclear arsenal. Their strategy relies on the assumption that a ballistic missile is unstoppable. If the Americans can put a shield over a city like Tel Aviv or an army base in the desert, then the Soviet nuclear threat is neutralized. The concept of deterrence is dead. The scramble intensifies. The KGB orders its operatives to get the software. They don't want the missile. They want the algorithm. They need to know how the Americans taught a computer to hit a bullet with a bullet. But while the Soviets are hunting for complex answers, looking for global networks and secret lasers, the truth is waiting in a dusty American research lab where engineers had quietly rewritten the rules of engagement. The enemy is looking for a new weapon, but they are being defeated by a new idea. The investigation has failed to find a weakness. In fact, it has only deepened the fear. The bogeyman is real, and he is standing guard over the American fleet. While the generals in the Kremlin were chasing shadows and concocting theories about space lasers and global satellite networks, the truth was sitting in a nondescript industrial park in Andover, Massachusetts, and a dusty testing ground in White Sands, New Mexico. The ghost that was haunting the Soviet military did not have a name like Star Wars. It had a boring, bureaucratic acronym: SAM-D. Later, the marketing department would give it a more patriotic name, fitting for the bicentennial era in which it was born. They called it the Patriot. But the weapon destroying the SCUDs over Saudi Arabia was not the Patriot the Soviets thought they knew. To understand the scale of the American achievement, you have to understand the silence of the American engineering labs. In the Soviet Union, military strength was measured in tonnage, in the roar of engines and the size of the blast. In the United States, in the late 1980s, strength was becoming silent. Strength was moving from steel to silicon. The Patriot program began decades earlier with a simple goal: shoot down airplanes. But as the Cold War evolved, the engineers at Raytheon and the US Army Missile Command realized that the threat was changing. The Soviets were mass-producing ballistic missiles like sausages. The proliferation of the SCUD meant that any third-rate dictator could threaten a US base. The American solution was not to build a bigger missile, it was to build a smarter brain. The heart of the mystery, the invisible wall that the Iraqi pilots were cursing, was the AN divided by MPQ-53 radar set. To a Soviet radar operator, a radar was a spinning dish. It swept around 360 degrees, creating a ping every few seconds. If a target moved between the pings, you lost it. If the target was moving at Mach 5, it could travel a mile between pings. A mechanical radar was simply too slow for the space age. The Americans replaced the spinning dish with a phased array. Imagine a flat face covered in over 5,000 tiny electronic transmitters, like the compound eye of a fly. Instead of physically turning the antenna, the computer shifted the timing of the electronic pulses by nanoseconds. This meant the radar beam could move instantly. It could look left, then right, then up, then focus on a specific point, all in the span of a microsecond. It had no moving parts. It had no inertia. It moved at the speed of light. This was the magic the Soviets couldn't see. The Patriot radar wasn't just scanning the sky, it was painting it. It could track 100 targets at once, prioritize them, identify which ones were threats, and guide 9 missiles simultaneously to different interception points. It was a capability gap so vast it wasn't just a technological lead, it was a different species of warfare. But the hardware was only half the story. The real secret, the one the KGB was desperate to steal, was the software upgrade known as PAC-2. When the crisis in the Middle East began to simmer in 1990, the US Army knew the standard Patriot, PAC-1, was designed to hit slow, fragile aircraft. If a PAC-1 missile hit a SCUD, it might damage it, but the heavy warhead would still fall on the target. They needed a way to kill the warhead itself. They didn't build a new missile from scratch. They didn't have time. Instead, the engineers pulled off a miracle of modification. They took the existing assembly line and introduced a new warhead with heavier fragments, 45 grams of steel instead of 2. They installed a new fuse. But most importantly, they rewrote the math. The project was a frantic race against physics. The engineers had to teach the missile's computer how to intercept a target diving at a 45-degree angle at 5,000 miles per hour. They developed a guidance concept called Track Via Missile, or TVM. This was the stroke of genius that baffled the Soviet analysts. In older systems, the ground radar did all the work, or the missile had its own tiny radar. Both had limits. In the Patriot system, the missile and the ground radar worked as a single, unified brain. The missile would fly towards the SCUD, its seeker looking at the target. But instead of processing that data itself, it beamed the raw data down to the massive computer in the truck on the ground. The ground computer, with far more processing power than could ever fit inside a missile, crunched the numbers, calculated the perfect intercept vector, and beamed the commands back up to the missile. It was a continuous loop of high-speed data conversation occurring, while the missile was screaming through the sky at Mach 3. The Soviets were looking for a brute force weapon. What they were facing was a distributed supercomputer. The PAC-2 upgrade pushed the system to its absolute limit. The engineers tweaked the algorithms to allow the missile to dive upward to climb to high altitude, and then dive down onto the incoming SCUD to match its trajectory. This reduced the closing speed and gave the fuse a fraction of a second longer to detect the target. And that fuse was the final piece of the puzzle. It wasn't a contact fuse. It was a proximity fuse, a tiny radar in the nose of the interceptor. The Americans calibrated it to detonate exactly when the SCUD was in the lethal cone of the blast. When the Iraqi SCUD launched, the American satellites, the Defense Support Program, would detect the heat bloom of the launch. That was the bell ringing. But the fight happened on the ground. The Patriot radar would see the missile as it crested the horizon. The computer would classify it TBM, Tactical Ballistic Missile. This is where the automatic legend was born. The geometry of the engagement was so fast, seconds from detection to impact, that human reflexes were useless. The American doctrine shifted control to the machine. The operators in the engagement control station, the ECS van, would turn the key to auto. From that moment, the software was in charge. The computer decided when to fire. The computer decided which launcher to use. The computer flew the missile. The humans were merely witnesses to their own creation. While the Soviets were frantically welding fuel tanks together to make their missiles fly further, American engineers were sitting in air-conditioned rooms debugging lines of code that would render those missiles obsolete. The ingenuity lay in the audacity of the attempt. To hit a bullet with a bullet was considered a fool's errand in the 1970s. The Americans proved it was just a math problem, and they had better calculators. The source of the mystery was not a single secret weapon, it was a system of systems. It was the integration of satellite warnings, phased array radar speed, and complex algorithms that could predict the future position of a hypersonic object. And the most terrifying part for the enemy? The Americans had done this quickly. The PAC-2 upgrades were rushed to the field just months before the shooting started. The software was still being patched as the first units deployed to the desert. As the first SCUDs began to rain down on January 17, the American crews in the ECS vans were watching their screens with a mix of confidence and terror. They trusted the math. They trusted the tech. But they had never done this in combat. The screen would show the track, a hostile diamond symbol dropping rapidly. The system would flash, engagement. The roar of the launch would shake the van. And then, the symbol would disappear. Intercept. To the American crews, it was a validation of a decade of work. To the Soviets watching from afar, it was the death knell of their military dominance. They realized they weren't just losing a skirmish in the desert, they were losing the technological war. The Americans had digitized the battlefield. The investigation was over. The Soviets knew what it was. It was the Patriot. But knowing the name didn't solve their problem, because now they had to accept that the United States could write software that could defeat the laws of ballistics. The moment of total clarity, the instant where specific suspicion hardened into horrifying fact, did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in a secure, soundproofed viewing room in the Soviet Ministry of Defense in Moscow. It is the third week of the air war. The generals are gathered around a bank of monitors. They are not watching classified satellite feeds. They are watching a recording of a CNN broadcast from the night before, taped in Tel Aviv. On the screen, the reporter is wearing a gas mask, his voice muffled. In the background, the sky is streaked with the now familiar contrails of the engagement. But the Soviet analysts pause the tape. They advance it frame by frame. They are looking at a specific engagement that occurred over the city of Dhahran in Saudi Arabia. Iraqi forces had fired a salvo of 3 Al-Hussein missiles. The timing was perfect. The trajectory was low. It was a stress test designed to overwhelm the American fire control computers. On the paused grain of the video, the generals see the 3 incoming warheads. Then, they see the response. It isn't a random barrage of defensive fire. It is surgical. 3 Patriot missiles rise from the ground. They do not waver. They do not chase decoys. They move with a terrifying robotic purpose. The first Patriot hits the first SCUD. The second hits the second. The third hits the third. 3 distinct flashes. 3 distinct kills. 100% interception rate in a saturation attack. The room is silent. The smoke from their cigarettes hangs heavy in the stagnant air. This is the reveal. For decades, Soviet military science was built on the concept of saturation. They knew American weapons were high-tech, but they believed they were fragile and expensive. The Soviet solution was always quantity. You cannot shoot down 100 missiles if you only have 50 interceptors. You overwhelm the system. You flood the zone. But the video on the screen proves that the math has changed. The American system didn't just shoot down the missiles, it did it efficiently. It didn't waste ammunition. It sorted the targets, assigned the killers, and cleared the sky in under 15 seconds. One of the senior ballistic experts stands up and delivers the verdict that no one wants to hear. They have solved the terminal phase problem. It is a dry, technical sentence, but it lands like a grenade. It means the Americans have successfully digitized the battlefield to a degree where human reaction time is irrelevant. The fog of war, the chaos that allows a numerically superior enemy to survive, has been lifted by silicon chips. The shock turns into a frantic desire to find a flaw. Surely the system has a blind spot. Surely it can be jammed. The Soviet advisors in Baghdad urge the Iraqi Air Force to mount a desperate counterattack. If the missiles can't get through, they must destroy the Patriot batteries themselves. They must kill the Archer to stop the arrows. This leads to the futile response. The Iraqis turn to their own pinnacle of Soviet aviation engineering, the MiG-25 Foxbat. The MiG-25 is a beast of a plane. It was designed specifically to terrify the West. It is the fastest interceptor in the world, capable of speeds exceeding Mach 3. It can fly higher than any Western fighter. It is a brute force solution to air dominance, massive engines strapped to a steel frame. The plan is simple. The MiG-25 seconds will launch a high-speed dash towards the border. They will use electronic jamming pods to blind the American radars. They will locate the Patriot batteries by their radar emissions and destroy them with anti-radiation missiles. The Soviet generals watch this operation closely. This is the clash of titans, the fastest Soviet jet against the smartest American shield. The MiG-25 seconds take off. They roar into the night sky, their afterburners glowing blue-white. They climb to 60,000 feet, where the air is thin and they are untouchable by standard defenses. They accelerate to Mach 2.5. They are screaming towards the Saudi border. But the ghost is waiting. The Patriot radar, the AN divided by MPQ-53, detects the MiG 25 seconds long before they reach the border. And this exposes the second, terrifying capability of the system that the Soviets had overlooked. The Patriot is not just a missile defense system. It is a dual-threat system. The software seamlessly transitions from anti-tactical ballistic missile mode to anti-aircraft mode. The phased array radar changes its beam focus. It doesn't get confused. It doesn't get jammed. The frequency-agile radar simply hops to a new channel that the Soviet-made jammers cannot block. The Iraqi pilots, flying the fastest jets in the world, suddenly hear the tone that every pilot dreads, the steady, high-pitched scream of a radar lock. They are miles away. They are flying in the stratosphere. They should be safe, but the American radar has them. It is tracking them with the same cold precision it used on the SCUDs. The Iraqis fire their anti-radiation missiles blindly and turn to run. They realize that they are not hunters, they are prey. The Patriot batteries don't even need to fire. The mere presence of the radar lock, the illumination by the death ray, forces the MiG 25 seconds to abort. They cannot get close enough to release their weapons accurately. The Soviet advisors watch the reports come in. The MiG 25 seconds return with their payloads unspent or dropped uselessly in the desert. The Foxbat, the terror of the Cold War skies, has been neutralized by a truck parked in the sand. The failure is total. The revelation deepens when Iraqi intelligence manages to get reports from the ground near the Patriot sites. They expected to find massive, permanent installations, concrete pads, bunkers, heavy cabling. Instead, they find empty sand. The Americans are using shoot-and-scoot tactics. The Patriot batteries are mobile. They fire, pack up in less than an hour, and move to a new location. By the time the Iraqis calculate the launch coordinates and fire a counter-battery SCUD, the Americans are gone. It is a game of whack, a mole, where the mole is invisible and carries a sledgehammer. The shock within the Kremlin begins to affect the broader strategic picture. The Soviet economy relies heavily on arms exports. They sell safety. They sell the ability to defend your airspace. But the world is watching Soviet technology fail in real time. Every burning SCUD falling from the sky is a billboard for American superiority. Every MiG-25 turning tail is a cancellation of a future contract. They realize that the shock is not just military, it is economic. Who will buy a SCUD missile now? Who will buy a MiG-29? The perceived value of the entire Soviet arsenal is plummeting by the hour. In a desperate bid to save face, the Soviet media begins to spin the narrative. They claim the Americans are lying about the success rate. They claim the debris falling on Tel Aviv proves the missiles are getting through. They try to argue that a mission kill, where the warhead is knocked off course but still explodes, is a failure for the Americans. But the military professionals know the truth. They know the difference between a warhead detonating on a target and a warhead breaking up at 20,000 feet. The confrontation reaches its peak when a high-ranking Soviet delegation meets to discuss the implications for their own nuclear deterrent. If the Americans can stop a SCUD, can they stop an SS-20? Can they stop an ICBM? The scientists argue that an ICBM is faster, re-entering at Mach 20. The Patriot cannot touch it. Physics still protects the strategic nuclear arsenal. But the generals are no longer sure. They argue that if the Americans have solved the guidance and tracking problems for the SCUD, it is only a matter of scaling. If they can hit a bullet, they can hit a cannonball. The principle is proven. The psychological barrier has been broken. The belief in mutual assured destruction was based on the idea that there is no shield, only a sword. The Americans have built a shield. As the air war draws to a close, the Iraqi missile crews are exhausted and demoralized. They are still firing, but it is an act of robotic defiance. They know the result before they turn the key. They are just providing target practice for the American computers. The reveal is complete. The mystery of the impossible events in the night sky has been solved. It wasn't magic. It wasn't aliens. It wasn't a glitch. It was the dawn of the precision age. And the Soviet Union, looking at its rust-covered tanks and unguided rockets, realizes it has been left behind in the 20th century. The smoke clears over the Arabian desert in late February 1991. The ceasefire is signed. The Iraqi army, once the fourth largest in the world, has been reduced to a procession of burning vehicles along the highway of death. But the true casualty of the conflict is not found in the wreckage of the T-72 tanks or the twisted metal of the MiG-29 aircraft. The true casualty is the Soviet perception of power. The verdict of the war is delivered not in a treaty, but in a statistic that reverberates through the halls of the Kremlin like a funeral bell. Over the course of the conflict, the Iraqi military fired approximately 88 al-Hussein SCUDs at targets in Saudi Arabia and Israel. In response, the US Army fired 158 Patriot missiles. The numbers that the world saw The numbers that were broadcast on every news channel from Tokyo to London told a story of absolute dominance. In the eyes of the global public, the American system had achieved a near miraculous success rate. While post-war analysis would later debate the exact percentage of warhead kills versus mission kills, the psychological impact was absolute. For 40 years, the Soviet Union relied on the strategy of the sledgehammer. If you cannot be accurate, be big. If you cannot be smart, be numerous. The SCUD missile was the embodiment of this philosophy, cheap, rugged, and plentiful. The Patriot was the counter-argument. It was expensive, fragile, and complex. But when the two philosophies collided in the night sky over Tel Aviv, the sledgehammer shattered against the microchip. The immediate impact is a geopolitical earthquake. The Soviet Union's primary export, aside from oil, was security. They sold the promise that their weapons could stand up to Western imperialism. They supplied Syria, Libya, Iraq, and North Korea with the tools of resistance. But after January 1991, the phone stops ringing in Moscow. Nations that had been loyal Soviet customers for decades suddenly pause. They look at the footage of the burning SCUDs. They look at the footage of the intact Israeli streets. And they realize that buying Soviet weaponry is no longer purchasing a deterrent, it is purchasing a target. The market for Russian-made air defense systems collapses overnight. Why buy an S-200 that failed to stop American jets when you can buy a Patriot that stops ballistic missiles? The economic lifeline of the Soviet military-industrial complex is severed at the exact moment the Soviet economy is entering its death spiral. But the legacy of this mystery goes deeper than arms sales. It strikes at the heart of the ideological struggle of the Cold War. For decades, the Soviets believed that history was on their side. They believed that their centralized command and control economy was superior to the chaotic, free market chaos of the West. They believed they could outproduce and outlast the Americans. The Patriot miracle proved that the nature of power had shifted. In the industrial age, power was measured in steel production and coal output. The Soviets were masters of the industrial age. But the world had moved into the information age. Power was now measured in lines of code, in processing speed, and in the miniaturization of electronics. The Patriot was not a triumph of heavy industry, it was a triumph of Silicon Valley. It was a weapon that required an ecosystem of innovation, computer science, and creative engineering that the rigid, compartmentalized Soviet system simply could not replicate. The Soviet analysts, who had spent weeks hunting for the ghost, realized that they couldn't just steal the blueprints and build their own Patriot. They could copy the missile shape, they could copy the radar truck, but they couldn't copy the software. They couldn't copy the dynamic, flexible thinking that allowed American engineers to rewrite the code in a week to fix a glitch. This is the macro theme that defines the end of the era. The Soviet Union didn't lose the Cold War on the battlefield of Europe. They lost it because they were trying to fight a digital war with analog tools. The Patriot interception became the symbol of this disparity. It showed that the Americans could solve problems that the Soviets deemed impossible. If the Americans could shoot down a missile, what else could they do? Could they really shoot down satellites? Could they really build the Star Wars shield? Before the Gulf War, the Soviet leadership suspected the American Strategic Defense Initiative was a bluff. After the Gulf War, they had to assume it was real. And they knew, with terrifying certainty, that they did not have the money or the technology to compete with it. The arms race was over. The Americans had won. Not by building more nukes, but by making the existing nukes obsolete. As 1991 drags on, the Soviet Union begins to dissolve. The failure of their client state in Iraq mirrors the failure of their own internal cohesion. The hardliners who try to stage a coup in August 1991 are the same men who watched the SCUDs fail in January. They are men who have lost their faith in their own power. The epilogue of this story takes us back to the desert, 1 year later. The Patriot batteries are gone, packed up and shipped back to Fort Bliss, or deployed to new flashpoints. The sand has reclaimed the berms where the radar trucks once stood. The sky is silent, but the world has changed forever. The footage of those streaks of light over Tel Aviv remains burned into the collective consciousness of a generation. It was the moment the world saw the future of warfare. It was a future where math triumphed over muscle, a future where the visible was helpless against the invisible. The mystery of the impossible interceptions was solved, but the lesson remains. In the high-stakes poker game of global dominance, the Soviet Union folded its hand not because it ran out of chips, But because it realized the other player was playing a completely different game, a game where the rules were written in binary code and the speed of light was the only speed that mattered. The Cold War ended not with a bang, but with a computerized intercept signal on a glowing green screen, confirming that the old world was dead, and a new, terrifyingly precise American hegemony had begun.